still my... Welcome to Speak Sex. I'm your host, Eurydice, and today's guest is a New York-based sex consultant, speaker, writer, thinker. Her name is Zhana Vrangalova, also known as Dr. Zhana. Welcome to the show and the podcast, Zhana.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Zhana has a PhD from Cornell University in developmental psychology, and she teaches human sexuality courses both at NYU and also in a series that everyone can join. It's global, and it's called the Uncensored Conversation. And she's also teaching an online course. We'll talk about all of that, which she calls Open Smarter, to help us make smarter decisions about sexuality, right? We're going to talk about everything from the state of, sex right now in the world, the state of kink, and also the confusion so many of us have with like cancel culture and how, the right way to say sex things, and also the power and the importance of working in this field, which, is what I'm really impressed with. And we were just talking about it right before the show, how unusual it still is for those of us who go to academia and get advanced degrees to focus on sexuality instead of, a number of more acceptable, right, traditional degrees, and how few schools actually give you that option.
Yes, I was always drawn to understanding humans and how we operate. And the most fascinating facet of humans that I could ever think of was sexuality and relationships. And sexuality was a very big part of my own personal development in life. I was a highly, highly sexual kid for as long as I can remember. Some of my earliest memories are of me masturbating, when I was like 4, and that continued throughout my early childhood and then teenage years. And I was always interested, curious about things that were not quite the norm. And where I grew up in Macedonia. It's a small country in Southeast Europe, fairly traditional in attitudes and patriarchal and very double standardy. Women can't really do many things that men are allowed to do, and a lot of slut shaming and so on. But despite that, I was just really curious about things that I wasn't supposed to be curious about. I wanted sex with multiple partners and wanted casual sex, and was interested in kink. I was attracted to all genders. I had non-heterosexual type relationships, and monogamy never made sense to me. I was very much from the beginning kind of like, why do we need to be monogamous? Like, I didn't quite get it. So I was just like naturally predisposed to be a bit of a sexual rebel, and doing that and being that in the context of a fairly traditional culture obviously made that a very salient part of who I was and how I navigated the world. And it made me super curious and super interested in figuring out, how do people like me, people who are kind of on that highly adventurous, highly sexual end of the spectrum, because everything's a spectrum, right? And some of us happen to be all the way on the high end of that spectrum. How do we navigate life? How do we navigate sex, love, and relationships in a way that is authentic to who we are, so we get to do these things that we're curious about, but at the same time maintain mental health, physical health, social health, belonging, community, connection? How do we love and be loved and not just have sex? And so yeah, that kind of is what drove my specific interest in studying sexuality. I did my undergrad in Macedonia in psychology, just general psychology. But during that time, I was already starting to do some research projects that were on the topic of sexuality, specifically on sexual orientation. And when time came to do my PhD, I was like, well, this has to be the thing that's going to keep my interest for the rest of my life, because it's so fascinating. It's so interesting. I'm never going to run out of things to study and topics to discuss.
That's right. I can tell you that's so true. Having spent a career in this, yeah. I do have a personal question. So just a footnote. You don't have an accent.
I don't have much of an accent. I have a little bit. It comes out every now and then in certain words. Yeah, I don't know why or how that happened.
Extraordinary. So both your parents are Macedonian. They're not native English speakers.
Yeah. They're both Macedonian or from that region. I grew up there. I lived there until I was 24, and that's when I moved.
Is that Skopje or
in Skopje? Right. Yeah, in the capital. I was born and raised in the capital. Yeah, and my
I'm Greek, so we are neighbors.
Oh, you're Greek.
Yeah,
and
yeah, and we probably have Alexander, as a common, like, conqueror that we claim.
As a common, yes, ancestor in a way.
Yeah. It's a common patriarchal, right? Yeah, patriarchal colonizer that we, jointly claim.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into politics.
No.
Yeah,
exactly. Not at all interested in, being credited, any of that.
Yeah, I don't particularly care.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of my origin.
What did your parents do? I was asking you before.
My dad was a professor at the university in Skopje. He was an electrical engineer and professor in electrical engineering. So I kind of grew up exposed very much to the professor life. So I always kind of knew I was going to do a PhD. I always wanted to be a professor because it seemed like a pretty good life. Like, you have a lot of freedom in terms of what you want to study, what you want to teach. You don't really have a boss. Like, you do have people above you, like the dean or whatever, but you don't really have a boss. And that fits my personality. I'm someone who doesn't particularly, I like to be able to kind of create my own
curriculum,
my own
structure, yeah. And also, as an engineer, it probably made you more curious about the technology of things. So, including the technology of sex now, right?
Sure.
Yeah, how it's done.
He definitely tried to instill in me this love of science more broadly. And he really kind of taught me all these different things, math and science and physics and chemistry and biology. And I loved all of those. And he was actually a little disappointed when I decided to go into psychology and not in some of the harder sciences.
Right.
But, yeah. It is what it is.
Yeah.
I decided that I wanted to be surrounded by and working with, engaging with humans rather than being in a lab and kind of, being in a more inanimate kind of environment for my work. And we
need more like you. We have plenty of people who take the the higher pay and they go into coding, the labs of all kinds,
right.
and that's all needed, as we found out, like with the pandemic. But at the systemic social level, the kind of change we need, so we can evolve socially, we really need, scientific kind of minds to work on the human level,
I agree.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
And your mom? What about your mom? I'm just curious, about the leap. I love all these stories of the huge leap we've made from one generation to the other when we actually work with sexuality and how far-fetched that is, considering. Yeah.
My mom was an economist. She worked at a big oil refinery firm as an economist. So they were both college educated.
Interesting. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Great. So, I feel that, one thing that I wanted to ask your opinion about is that I have always been kink, positive, of course, and and believed in polysexuality and poly everything, polygender identity, non-binary. But I have a specific theory about this, which is that it is a way to get us out of the modalities of the patriarchy. There is no like grand normative, scheme, or like social programming that we can take on that will divorce sex from procreation. So even though scientists, amazing scientists like your dad, have come up with birth control and then, in vitro, and then more and more affordable and specific ways to distinguish sex from procreation. In the general mind, in everyone's understanding of the two, they're still together as one, the way that they were like 5,000 years ago, right? And I feel also for the freedom of all people from like gender tropes and all of the other judgments, moral as well as intellectual that we go through, that we've inherited from those 5,000 years. It's important to kind of understand the nuts and bolts and try things out, right, for ourselves, because it's a way to intellectualize sex one-on-one. It's a way for like everybody to try and say things about sex that are hard to say, but are not that emotional, that are more like practical, which is really like a practical way of making that separation, between like the unspeakable, which once it was, and the practical, which hopefully it's becoming, like practical ways to common pleasure and intimacy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, the evolution of sexual desires and interests and norms throughout human history. I definitely think we have greatly decoupled sex from reproduction. And we certainly have successfully done it, and we have very reliable methods of doing that are available to many people, not everybody in the world, but to a pretty large majority of people in the world. And so that has created a very different world that we live in right now than our ancestors have lived in for, many, many millennia, not just 5,000 years, many, many more years than that. But of course, the 40, 50 years that we've had birth control and all of these things that have decoupled sex from reproduction, that's a blip in our evolutionary history. That's a very short period of time in terms of our evolutionary history. And we carry still in us, in our genes and what's
right,
encoded.
In our epigenetics, right?
Yeah, genes and epigenetics. Yeah, these mechanisms, these tendencies, these preferences, these patterns of thinking, desiring, and behaving that we have kind of inherited because for the very, very long history of human evolution, sex and reproduction went together. If you had sex, chances were a baby was going to be born, and there were consequences of that decision. And so there are certain gender differences in how we think about our sex lives because of that evolutionary history. And there are also a lot of individual differences within men and within women. And luckily, right, we live now in a world where those things are separate and we can pull them apart and focus on one versus the other, and not having those consequences of sex, the reproductive consequences of sex being always tied to it, that frees us from a lot of those kind of old patterns. Of course, that also takes time to actually really permeate into the human psyche and into our gene pool. And that's going to be a slightly longer process. But I'm really excited about it. I mean, the fact that we have that separation really allows, it provides a huge luxury in a way, especially for women, to enjoy their sexuality for what it is, unrelated to reproduction and free from those fears and concerns about reproduction. So it's an exciting time to be alive, and it's an exciting time to be a woman in particular, and certainly a non-binary person. You know,
exactly.
It was hard being a non-binary person back in the day, or a trans person or something.
Oh, there was no name for it. Imagine, like how confusing can that be when there is no name for what you feel and who you are? So much unnecessary suffering, you know, like globally, by so many generations of like people who were non-traditional, and you know, just kept bumping, I guess, their heads against all the obstacles everywhere around them, you know, trapped and imprisoned by norms. And like, norms are just statistical terms. So as we change, and that's why your work's so valuable, because as we change and open up, like, you know, we're literally changing slowly the numbers of what's normal.
Absolutely.
The majority, the majority view. Yeah, I know.
I'm very excited about that.
Yeah. Me too. I am in awe of it. So tell me a little bit about your global conversation, Uncensored. You know, I mean, I would like to join and hear it myself. But what are people talking about the most? What are they looking for the most? What are they having most difficulty with? What do you have to report from the ground, from the global conversation?
So Uncensored is a pretty unique format for conversations. So you should definitely come and check it out. It's a 2-hour conversation based on Zoom. So people can come in from anywhere in the world, and people do come in from everywhere in the world. We have people from Europe, from Australia, from South Africa, from South America. And so it's a pretty mixed crowd. And each time we talk about a particular topic that, you know, we choose ahead of time, and that I start the conversation on my Instagram account, and then kind of take that into this more dynamic, face-to-face, in a way, conversation. And it's not really a talk. It's not me talking or presenting stuff. I will share some science and data here and there, but it really is a group conversation where the people who come in, they share their experiences, they share their thoughts on those topics, and it's a very communal, kind of community-based experience that people find extremely beneficial to their lives. They learn things about themselves, they learn things about other people, they get a chance to kind of expand their horizons, because they're sitting in the same room as people who have very different experiences from them, very different backgrounds. They often feel like they've worked through some shame and guilt and other forms of emotional pain that they might have experienced around sexuality. They feel a sense of belonging and community, because they feel like, oh, there are other people like me out there in the world. Because very often what I see is people just feeling so isolated in their desires and behaviors, and especially the people who are, again, a little higher on that novelty spectrum, sexual excitement, sexual sex drive, sexual adventurousness spectrum. We're very often ostracized. We're often told that's not normal. That's not okay. You have daddy issues, or, you know, something happened to you in the past that is making you feel that way. And so to be in the room with a lot of other people who are like, oh no, that's perfectly normal. You just happen to be on the high end of the spectrum. No big deal. Here are some tools for how you can live that life in a way that's pleasurable and safe and responsible and ethical to the other people involved. Yeah. So that is kind of the mission and vision of Uncensored, to bring these conversations in an open and honest way without censorship, kind of beyond cancel culture. We try to understand each other, even if we come from very different backgrounds and have very different lived experiences and perspectives on certain things. I think it's really important to be able to sit in the same room and have some of those discussions and try to understand, why am I this way and why is someone that way? And then how do we find a set of rules or guidelines or whatever you want to call it, so that we can coexist in the world with, the people who are higher on the risk-taking and adventure side of things, and the people who are lower and who don't want to have the level of, risk-taking, if you will, that some of us want to have. So how do we coexist? And it's been a fascinating experience. I've been doing it since December of 2020. So it's going to be 5-6 months at this point. We've had lots of conversations on lots of different topics on casual sex, non-monogamy, kink, masturbation is the next one, orgasms, consent, objectification, sex work, porn. So lots of different topics that we've discussed. And it's a fascinating conversation. Come join.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And I think you, for your own work and your study, will learn a lot from it. And what I love about it is, again, how it, helps us evolve, because it breaks down our particular cultural taboos. So like your taboos in your culture may be very different from my taboos in my culture. And if I give you permission, because in my culture that's okay, you can give me permission, because in your culture what I'm doing that is so like shamed in my neighborhood, in my family, in my religion, in yours it's fine. So we get to compare we get to compare, like, basically our standards. And hopefully we realize, wait, it's all like so arbitrary, like you could just like change it, and right, it's just up to us, really.
I think one of the really impactful aspects of Uncensored is that we have people from all over the world, and those cross-cultural differences really come to the surface. I mean, we have people, women from Iran and someone from Saudi Arabia, and then have the Europeans, the Danes and the Dutch and the Germans and the Brits, and then the Americans, the Australians and the South Americans. So very, very different kinds of social norms around sexuality. And just being in the same room with that, you're like, wow, okay, I see, how and why things are the way they are over there. And it helps us. I think what's going on right now in America with some of the conversations around sexuality that we've been having around Me Too and like gender and sexual orientation, those kinds of things, it's a very culturally myopic, very culturally narrow view in terms of how things are. I think Americans very often don't really know how things work in the rest of the world, and think that, what's happening here is the only right thing and the only way to do things, and that it's happening in the whole world, and that's everybody in the whole world wants certain things. And I think it's very important to understand that people are at very different points of all of these, phenomena. And stepping outside a little bit of our own bubble is hugely valuable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. So it's a great initiative. So tell us a little bit about the Open Smarter method, which is a personality-based approach to relationship choice and relationship design, and it helps, based on your personality, figure out your relationship, choices, open choices, which are easy for you and which are a stretch for you, right? So you've developed this kind of skill set, and that you share. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So that's my online course called Open Smarter, which is basically, as you said, a personality-based approach to relationship design, because we all have our own unique personality that is relevant to how we're going to go about doing our sex and relationships, what kinds of things we're going to want, what kinds of things we don't really want, what kinds of things we might be good at, what kinds of things we might not be so good at. And there are certainly these things that can certainly change. We have the ability to change them over time with effort and kind of concerted effort. But we also all have a baseline, part of which is biological, genetic, and part of which, of course, is always also socialized. But based on, I think we first kind of have to understand ourselves and who are we and our basic personality before we kind of go out in the world and try to find the kinds of relationships or the kinds of partners that are going to be a good fit for us. I think one of the most important choices that we make about our relationships is, are they going to be completely monogamous, or are they going to be some form of open? Are they going to be completely open and, poly and this and that? And this is something that a lot of people just don't even think about, because we have monogamy as the default decision that everyone just kind of accepts without even thinking, without talking about it, without really thinking it through. But then we get stuck in relationships that are not a good fit for us. For a lot of people, complete lifelong monogamy is not the way to go.
Sorry, I'm like, what? For what?
Yeah, for some it is. For many people it is, but for many people it isn't.
Lifelong, no less. At least like for the duration of the relationship, maybe more practical.
Yeah, certainly. And a lot of people do that. In fact, most people these days in the US certainly will have serial monogamy as their kind of relationship style. But very often those relationships are serial monogamous because people cannot incorporate some level of openness. And often they end up in things like cheating and in things like frustration and really kind of this like low grade but constant daily dissatisfaction, and that builds up into resentment and whatnot. And so I think a lot of people would benefit from examining that monogamy versus non-monogamy set of options. And I think more and more people really are these days. There is so much curiosity that I'm seeing. You're asking, what can I report from the ground from some of the uncensored conversations we've been having? Some of the most popular topics that we've had in Uncensored have been around open relationships, threesomes, kind of navigating some of that non-exclusivity. And I think more and more people are realizing that complete monogamy is just not going to cut it for them. And so they're now trying to figure out, okay, how can we incorporate some level of openness into our relationships? And there are a lot of books and podcasts and all that to help guide people into that process. But what I've not seen anywhere else is this like basic framework for how to even think about it that's based on our unique personality. And I think that's a great place to start with those explorations, because we're different. What's going to work for me is not going to work for you. And a huge part of that is because of our personality. So yeah, the Open Smarter course, the Open Smarter method really is a process of getting to know yourself and your unique personality, and how that personality, where you fit on those continua, on those personality spectra, influences which types of relationships might be a good fit, not a great fit, easier for you to handle versus more challenging. And again, it's not to say that if something is more challenging that you can't do it. You absolutely can. But I think it's important to know that that's what you're signing up for, right? That, okay, if you're, say, a highly jealous person, you can still do non-monogamy, but it's going to be a lot more work.
Oh boy, yeah.
Who's lower on
Yeah,
jealousy. You're
yeah,
going to have to
yeah,
incorporate and
yeah,
implement a lot more strategies and all that to make
yeah.
that work.
So it's a little like the love language, like when they were doing what's your love language, let's say, sort of like what's your monogamy spectrum or something like
You
that.
can think
Yeah.
of it that way a little bit. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
What's
mean,
your relationship personality? Yeah.
right, yeah. And that I think that does make sense. Like if you catch yourself, probably you have a failure and then you go back and you're like, okay, what am I getting wrong? And that's great. Instead of like thinking the person is wrong and I'm going to repeat the exact same routine, but with a different candidate and,
Yeah. I mean, that's what often happens for people, right? They get into
they blame
relationships.
the individual and they get stuck in that constant like rewind,
Yeah, they think, they get into a relationship, it's kind of good for some period of time, and then they start desiring other people for one reason or another, and then they think, oh, that's because this is the wrong person for me. It's not the one. When I find the one, because that's
I know, right? And when I find my ride or die, this will not happen. And it's like,
exactly, I will never.
This is as good as it gets.
Yeah, and that's the thing. For a lot of us who are high on that sexual adventurousness side of the spectrum, no one person is ever going to be enough, because we want novelty. We want different partners. We want sexual novelty. We want emotional and romantic novelty. And so the only authentic way to live our lives is to have some form or some level of openness. And it's not going to get solved by jumping from one monogamous relationship to the next, to the next, to the next, thinking, oh, that's the next one is going to be the one. And then I'm going to start desiring other people. Probably not going to happen. But
yeah. But I do find, again, I'm now reporting from the ground myself. I do find that both personally and just from the field research in my big group of acquaintances and friends, it's your odds get, lowered dramatically the more you're direct and open. And sometimes it's even the case, it may even be the case that when you know exactly what you need and you say it, it's so alienating by definition, in its simplicity, in its expression, that it may just threaten, the potential partner away. And had you done that in like the more traditional ways of like fighting and, drama and pushing and staying together and not wanting to lose each other and the whole like emotional work, right? Then you might have had a relationship. So it's still so, what I'm saying is it's still so foreign that it can feel to people, you could be like a proposition in someone and they could hear that as a rejection. And that has definitely, happened to me.
Yes,
I watch it like in real time. Like I just said this in a way that completely, scared this person away.
Yeah, and I hear that. Unfortunately, yes, we still live in a world where even just bringing that up is going to scare people away, because that's not the norm and people don't expect it. People don't want to be faced with it. Even if they themselves have the desires, they don't want to think about their partner having such desires for other people. It's hard. It's not an easy thing when you've been socialized to think that that's the worst possible thing that can happen, or that that's a sign of you not loving your partner or not being committed to your partner. It's a very strong gut reaction that people have to not accept it, even if they themselves feel it, or they themselves are going to feel it in 2 years or in 5 years. So it's not easy. I agree. It's not easy to have that open, honest conversation, whether early on or later on in a relationship. But I think there are more and more people realizing that, and I think we start with acknowledging that we are going to have desires for other people. And so then the question just becomes, what do we do
That's
about
good.
those
That's
desires?
already like a huge, a huge red flag. You know, like telling someone, I really want to be with you. I'm also assuming that I will want to be with other people. It's like, what? Well, then you don't want to be with me enough. I'm sorry.
Well, the
Like,
reality is,
why would I sign up to be with someone who's going to cheat on me? Like, it's just also contradictory, right?
yeah, I mean, but the reality is 90+% of people in relationships report having desires and fantasies for other people.
Thank you.
So it's literally every single one of us. It's just that some of us admit it and are trying to deal with it in an honest way, in a transparent way, and the rest of us are trying to pretend that that doesn't exist. And so I think the more and more we come into this new world, new sexual world where consent is a big thing, right? We are much more cognizant of sexual consent. Well, what we're talking about here is relationship consent.
Yeah.
Right? That we have these desires. What are we going to do about them?
Yeah.
The typical thing is to either suppress those desires, or cheat.
Yeah.
And, 30, 40, 50% of people will have cheated on a partner. If all of those cheaters were just honest about their desires to have some level of openness in their relationship, even, it doesn't even have to be very explicitly negotiated. I think for a lot of people who don't want to deal with the discomfort that comes with acknowledging the fact that your partner might have other desires, I think if we just shifted our expectation that from my partner's never going to want anything with anyone else to my partner's probably going to want to have something with someone else, just like I'm going to probably want to have something with someone else.
Yeah.
And if I don't want to deal with being faced with that reality, let's just not talk about it. But the assumption is there. The assumption needs to switch, because for the vast majority of humans on the planet, they are going to want other people, and many of them are going to act on those desires. And so you have two options when you come into it. Either you pretend that that's not the case, you lie to yourself and lie to your partner that that's not the case, that that's not going to happen to you and your partner, which is just not true. It's going to happen to both you and your partner, at least the desire part. And you can either pretend that it's not there and hope that you can suppress your desires, that your partner can suppress their desires, and no one's going to cheat. Or you can acknowledge it, at least to yourself, and kind of come into it understanding that that probably will happen at some point, and maybe set some ground rules around when and how it's okay for that to happen. How much do you want to know about it? How much does your partner want to know about it? And approach it with a little bit more honesty and consent.
Yeah. I mean, to me that makes a lot of sense, but I have to confess that when I try to practice it, at least in my life, as much as I find it comforting, and I find it reassuring, particularly because if we have this conversation early, when we are 100% into each other, then we can have this conversation without the assumption that there is already someone else, at that very second. I feel better having this conversation when there is no one else I want to be with, but I would like to put some an agreement in place as to how we're going to deal with it, when it happens. And yet it's something that I find, very, it's received pretty much like an admission of guilt. It's received as if I'm already confessing that, there's someone else, and I want permission, and it's not at all, and also like the negotiation, a negotiation means that there is no agreement in place until we have gone through these conversations and come up with what would work for just us, for
right,
for who you are and who I am at this moment in our journey when we meeting each other and we want to be with each other. But I'm saying that, I love this idea of shifting our assumption. If we could, kind of like have a mass cultural shift of the assumption we begin with, as you say, right? Open with. To assume that we will desire other people, and that's not personal. It's just kind of existential. It's how we are. Then maybe there will be an easier way to say all that stuff without the implications. The psychological kind of like burden of it all. And I mean, you studied psychology. I do feel that, Freud and all these patriarchs did not do us much good, in the long run with the, their kind of like simplistic, nuclear family based explanation of our psyches. Yeah. So
yeah, that's why we're now slowly moving the needle. And there are parts of the world, the French are kind of notorious, right, for having, I think, that assumption. For them, the assumption is probably we're going to have affairs, and that's okay. We don't have to talk about it. Like they exist very much in a kind of a don't ask, don't tell assumption going in. And I'm seeing more and more people operating on that assumption.
The Italians too, for sure.
And the French are unique because the women think that way as well as the men, because the reality is across the world, across the world, there have been so many cultures, both in the present and in the past, where the men have had that expectation for themselves.
Right, that's right.
The women had that expectation for the men.
That's
right? That was allowed. That was totally possible for the men. What's new now is our request for equality and for the women to also have that same freedom. I mean, you have whole cultures where the men
polygamy.
Can have 4 wives,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
All of the Muslim world basically operates on men can have 4 wives if they can afford them. And you have so many parts of like Latin America where it's kind of understood that the men are going to be cheating and whatnot. The women are catching up, certainly, in many parts of the world.
That's a nice way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, and the more we put value on equality, the more that's going to be happening in other areas, the more that's going to be happening in this area as well. And so I am seeing it more and more. I've been talking to a lot of women who are now coming into relationships saying, I just spoke to someone a few weeks ago who said, look, if we're not going to have a conversation about monogamy, when I get together with someone and we don't have a conversation about monogamy, I don't know what I don't know what his expectation is. My expectation is that we're going to be fucking other people.
That's so refreshing.
Yeah, that's my expectation. I will probably hook up with someone else at some point. I expect that he will also probably hook up with someone else at some point. And if he doesn't bring it up, she says, I personally don't need to talk about it. I'm happy with kind of having that be a don't tell policy. Yeah. But if he wants to bring it up, then we can have a conversation. But if we don't have a conversation, why is the default expectation that means we're monogamous? She's like, I think the default expectation is that we're not monogamous until or unless it's been specifically negotiated that it is monogamous. And I think that's how we need to start approaching things,
right,
instead of thinking
we
of monogamy.
don't, so that's kind of, but we don't, like, we do need that mass shift that you talked about. Otherwise, what ends up happening is we kind of justify to ourselves, we're like, well, okay, we haven't outright committed 100% to monogamy. Like, we haven't said it's completely verboten. So the assumption is we're not, and then of course you're interested in someone else and you tell the person that you met someone else you really like too. And they're like, what? We're not monogamous? Are you what? Right? So we get into like a mess from not starting from the same place. And having like a kind of joint maturity. But I do love the way you said it, that it is, after all, women kind of like catching up. And we're looping to how we started, partly thanks to the separation between procreation and sex. Women now are like catching up to the perks that many men, at least men of means, have had in most cultures.
Yep, absolutely. And so, a huge part of the shift really that needs to happen is, well, on one hand, women coming into their own and saying, I want this, I want multiple partners, I don't want monogamy, and kind of embracing that. But also in order for women to be able to embrace that, they need the men that they are attracted to, the men that they want to marry and date and all of those things. The men also have to accept it. The men also have to say, okay, I'm
fair and square.
I'm going to deal with all of the cultural and biological underpinnings of that feeling of possessiveness, like, this is my woman, nobody else can, have sex with my woman, kind of thing. And that's not easy to overcome either, especially when you've had the monopoly on non-monogamy for so many millennia. And then all of a sudden the women are saying, no, I want another penis as well. And kind of get over there's going to be another penis in my wife's or girlfriend's body. And that's a big, I think, obstacle that collectively we all need to overcome to, support our men into overcoming that, what's traditionally thought of as like a blow to their masculinity, and help them, get to a place where they can absorb that, just like we can absorb them being with other women in the heterosexual world, at least.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And they do need they do need help and support, because for so many of them, like, their sense of masculinity is defined by possessing people of of different procreative gender, basically.
How we've been that's how we've been socialized. And a lot of people fault individual men for that. I have a hard time doing that. We're all victims.
I don't fault any.
We're all victims of the same sex negative, double standard type of socialization that we've all been exposed to and have internalized to various degrees. And so it's about undoing some of that damage slowly, and different people are going to be able to undo that damage faster than other people, and it's going to be easier than other people. So I think we all really need support, the men, women, and non-binary folks. We all need support in that process of kind of getting rid of that shame, of the guilt, of that very kind of narrow view of what masculinity is, and hopefully get to a more open and more honest, really, world, because we're talking about honesty. We're talking about being, not lying, not pretending that certain things that exist actually exist.
Yeah. And I do want to emphasize what you said, that the men need our support, and they also need, the kind of like help to make the passage, it's not it's not easy to come up with the right words that are not already colored and weighed by all of that inherited meaning and emotions that get triggered by those words and those meanings. So kind of like, this is a process of cleansing. And but I do think that modern divorce in the cultures that do allow it is a way for men to kind of learn this lesson. It's a tough lesson, right? But it's a way that the law kind of like gets them through that pain of letting go. This is what it was. Owning, so to speak, another person, right? A beloved. So if you don't want to do that again, and have that person have those same rights on whatever it is, your property, etc., then maybe you can evolve and think of like relationships, anew, and make them more equal and participatory and inclusive and open,
intentional. And I want to say, when we talk about kind of open relationships, not monogamy, I think a lot of people imagine that, it's going to be like completely open. There are going to be no rules, like free for all, orgies every weekend, And the reality is, you can certainly have that if that's your thing. I do know people who are having orgies every weekend and have a pretty free for all, but that's the extreme version of non-monogamy. This is all a spectrum from complete, strict, complete monogamy all the way to that orgies every weekend, or like the crazy poly, thruples and quads and like polycules and whatnot. There is a huge range of monogamish, options in the middle between that complete monogamy and the complete openness. And actually, I think for the vast majority of people, that's what is the best fit. That's what makes most sense. Mostly monogamy, couple-based relationships where the couple is like the primary romantic and sexual unit, and then a little bit of openness, a little bit of exploration, a little bit of spice on top of that. And often it doesn't even have to involve doing anything with other people. There are a lot of different ways that you can incorporate some of that excitement and novelty. The idea of the third, Esther Perel talks about that really well, the bringing the third into the bedroom in ways that are not physical, by sharing fantasies about a potential third, or I think that's flirting, by flirting with other people without actually doing anything, or you can go to a sex party with your partner and not do anything with anyone else. Just being in that environment, watching people playing with each other, being watched by others can in a way invite that third, and can at least acknowledge that people have these desires. And so it really starts with acknowledging that we have desires for other people, and then deciding as a couple, as a unit, how are we going to address that? Are we going to act on it in certain ways? Are we going to, incorporate as fantasies? Are we going to watch porn together and do it that way? There's so many different ways to incorporate some level of openness that at least acknowledges the reality of what we're experiencing internally, as opposed to having to hide that and pretend it's not there. For sure. Exposing comes first. No pun intended. And as you said, like real life, we're so busy. If you have like a full-time job, and then you start a family, and you have children, and you have a home to look after, there is no time for all the orgies. That's why it was always like the privilege of the counts and the uber rich, right? Like the Saad had a title and a couple of castles that he inherited. So, and he had access to like the girls in the village that he was in charge of. Right.
So, you don't just, there is no, in real life, in our modern digital life, there is, practically speaking, like no time for so much excess, sexual exchange. It's just about what happens when you feel attracted to someone and you want to pursue it, and you really don't want to, at that time, think that that means that your current relationship is over with. So that's another kind of like assumption that we can evolve out of, that just being attracted to someone else doesn't, for me, mean that I don't want to be with you, or I never want to see you or touch you again.
Absolutely.
So how do you work that out when it's not, the definition we were given, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is so true, and it happens to so many of us. And I think so many good relationships have ended unnecessarily because people could not sort of incorporate the fact that the attraction for someone else existed at the same time as their love and commitment to the previous partner. I think we would see a lot fewer breakups and divorces if people were able to have some of that freedom. If this is a good relationship, things are compatible, you have a good life together, there's a lot of overlap between your life, their life, and there's love and care and commitment and all of that. It's a pity for that relationship to end just because there's some like new sexual excitement or interest. And yeah, I think a lot more relationships would be saved if people could just accept that and absorb that into some form of openness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. So yeah, open smarter. That's one way. And Uncensored. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Zhana. And I love the conversation. I hope we have more. I hope we get an opportunity to talk again. Yeah, this is great. And everyone out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. And until next week, keep speaking sex. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God. My name is Eurydice Eve, and I'm a writer and artist best known for writing for Scribner and Spin, and these are my conversations with leaders in diverse human communities. Join our flow and stay with us for a while.